Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures, Daily Dose of Nature. Today's topic, Post-Processing Workshop, Lightroom and Photoshop for Landscape Photography. Presented by NatHab Expedition Leader, Charlie Reinertsen. I'm your host, Rob Mess. Thank you so much for being here with us today. Charlie, take it away.
Thanks, Rob, and thanks everyone for joining. Today is going to be a fairly technical chat, and I'll talk a little bit about some of the places, the ecology of the places, and the subjects that we're going to be looking at. But mostly today is a deep dive into my workflow in Lightroom. Uh, and as I was getting ready for this webinar, I was going to pull some of my favorite shots together to edit and kind of show you how I got to the final product. But then I thought it would be more helpful to see start to finish a bundle of photos that I haven't even processed yet. So you're going to be seeing everything live. There's no kind of preconception of where I'm headed in the photo editing. And you're also going to get a look at my process for how I take a huge, memory card of photos from a single outing and whittle it down to my favorite shots. And so we're going to be looking at it through the lens of Lightroom, which is an Adobe product. It's kind of the industry standard for photo editing, but all of the principles of what we're going to be doing together will apply to any editing software that you have. And a lot of these controls are going to be fairly familiar because we're at a point where even our phones have editing software built in, and so some of the sliders will be really familiar. And I think even if you're brand new to thinking about editing your photos, you'll take something away from this. And if you're a veteran, you're going to see somebody else's workflow, which for me is when I just cherry pick different things that I want to start doing in my workflow. And eventually it makes you more and more efficient and more, dialed in how you do this. We're going to dive in here. I'm going to walk you through. I take photos off of my memory card, I put them onto my hard drive or onto external hard drives. And then I start this wonderful journey of photo editing. Along the way, we're going to talk a little bit about tools that you can use if you're doing a ton of photo editing like me. You are at risk of developing tendonitis or problems with your hands. And so you want to invest in an ergonomic mouse, something that might look like this, that's vertical, and your hand wraps around like this. Or another ergonomic version is kind of more of your classic mouse like this. These are Logitech, and they're expensive, but they're worth their weight in gold because you won't develop problems from editing photos. So let me just switch back to the right one. There are also um, you can get these physical platforms that when you're looking at the screen right now, I'll just get you oriented. On the right hand side is your editing panel. You've got your histogram up on the top, which tells you what wavelengths of light are represented in the image. Your darks, your shadows are on the left hand side of the histogram, and your lights, your brights are located on the right hand side. These carets up here are going to indicate whether your image is experiencing clipping. And so a lot of what we're going to talk about is the mechanics of taking a photo and then how to address that, any issues you might have had in taking the photo and properly exposing it to be able to edit that out in Lightroom. So this histogram is one of the number one tools that I use to reference as I'm making edits to these sliders on this side. But what I was going to mention before we get into this is that if you are doing a ton of editing, it's worth investing in um, uh, basically it's a huge keyboard that puts all of these dials on a physical manipulated dial, like a manual dial for each of these sliders. And that way you're not clicking and dragging for every individual thing, which again can lead to some issues with your hands. So take care of yourselves. Photo editing can be a black hole that you never come out of. Takes a lot of time. And today I'm going to try and show you ways to spend less time doing that and more time taking photos. So let's head back in. This is Lightroom Classic. So there are a few different Lightroom versions. I use Classic. I find it to be the best like organizational system. I'm going to skip over how I organize photos because other people do that better than me. We're in the develop panel over here. And just to get you oriented, I usually like to start in the library. So I'll import photos. Right here, it's the previous import. There are 184 from that session. Down at the bottom, this little icon, bottom left, there's a little grid icon. And that's going to pop you out so that you can see all the photos from that session that you just uploaded. My first step that I do, I don't want to waste my time editing photos until I pick my favorites. So I'm just going to go in here to this grouse. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to give them a star rating system. And the first time that I go through my photos, I'm going to give it either 1 star or 0 stars. And from there, I can then filter out the zeros and only look at the ones. So we're going to do this super fast. I try to make it a gut decision of whether or not this photo is something that I'm interested in spending more time on, because at the end of the day, 180 pictures is way too many. I'm never going to use that much. I want to cull it down. So the way that I assign a star value is down here. You see these grayed out stars where my cursor is. You can click that to assign it 1 star, or you just use your keypad and click on the number 1 to give it a star. So I'm just going to rapidly go through here. The other thing you can do is in this view, you can adjust the size of the thumbnails. So in a first pass like this, I remember what I took when I was in the field, and I remember some of the first shots. This is organized in reverse order for some reason. The first couple shots of this bird were the best because I just happened to have the settings right. So these first few, so I'm just going to look at those. That one's bad. It's out of focus. This one is medium. And then I'm just going to cycle back and forth until I decide, hey, that eye is pretty sharp. I really like that. I got the focus right. There's a little bit of movement because it's a little bit of a slow shutter speed, but mostly I like that photo. I'm going to keep that one. So I give it a 1. And then I continue through the photo library like that. And I'm just going to, for the purposes of this, right now we're looking at close-up images of sphagnum moss with a macro lens. I shot it at a 105 millimeter. Depending on your computer, when you're cycling through quickly to see which photo you like, it might take a minute for the computer to catch up. So my suggestion is make sure that the image you're looking at is fully buffered, because if you click in, it might look out of focus, but actually your computer is just struggling to keep up. So I like this one. I just start it. Those are out of focus. I don't like the focus of those. I'm not crazy about those. In the real world, I would spend more time on this task, but for the purposes of this talk, I'm just going to move through here really quickly. I love that the focus is on the bog cranberry. I ate that cranberry. It was delicious. This time of year, if you're out in a swamp and you find trailing cranberries, if it's this morning, it was frosty, right? Like these berries froze. And that's when they're perfect because that freezing actually kind of takes away the bitter taste, and they taste just like Thanksgiving after a nice freeze. Not crazy about the focus on these photos. And if you're getting impatient, I'm only going to spend about 5 more minutes selecting photos, and then we're going to get into the actual workflow of how I edit. So I'm just going to grab a couple of these. This one looks great. I like the focus there. This is interesting. That's a boardwalk with super macro, looking at some frost formations. really interesting there. And then I went through a series of super close-up images, and there's a bog cranberry right embedded in the middle of that one. Here I'm using a 20 millimeter lens, but getting really up close to the subject, which I'm pretty happy with. And this is the first time I'm reviewing these images, so my reactions right now are what I've got. So I like the frost. These are pitcher plants, which are carnivorous plants. They will eat the bugs by dissolving them in this protein. So you're getting a sense of like, as I'm out there photographing these things, I'm just like, when I'm out, especially in a peatland, which is where all of these pictures were taken, I'm just looking for interesting little vignettes. And then I think about the different lenses that I have available. Like here, this is some Labrador tea sticking up out of the sphagnum moss, and it was backlit by the sun. And it just was creating this really beautiful outline. And the biggest challenge here in this little moment was trying to figure out where to put the focus, because I really liked how this was happening, but I wasn't crazy about. I didn't have a tripod on this hike, so I was just hand holding, and I wish I had a tripod so I could do a smaller aperture and get a deeper depth of field so that more is in focus. And then I spent some time, there were some really interesting refractions happening just from the light hitting all of that frost buildup on the sphagnum moss and then reflecting. And so I spent some time just pushing the focus so it's not focusing on anything and it could actually capture some of the refractions that were happening. So this shot is just slightly angled down and out of focus, and then this shot is pushed up, and then there's something in focus. So it's a little conceptually like a little confusing, but when I edit these, I'm excited about these ones. And here you just saw a change in the exposure. So I was wondering, maybe I'm overexposing these. I want to see what happens if I underexpose this image. I was in aperture priority when I was shooting these photos, and just being super playful with like the circumstances out there. Um, so I like that one. You're just seeing me go through and number these, 1 or 0. And in a moment, ooh, I like that one. That composition was different. In a moment, we're just going to get to the end of this and start editing. So I'm happy with that one. That's out of focus. This is with a drone. So I wanted to include a couple of these because as soon as you include sky, um, exposure gets really challenging. So I just wanted to edit a couple of those live. And then we're just about to the end here. Ooh, that one is super cool. Very happy with that. Seeing some wildlife trails crossing the sphagnum moss out in that peatland. A couple of these were the long lens. All right, we're at the end of the exercise. Now, I'm going to go down here to this little tab, and it's hard to see. I'm going to turn off my camera so that it just maximizes the view on your screen. Down here on the right, it says filter, and I'm going to select rated. And immediately, if you see the time strip along the bottom, it just whittled this collection down to 34 images. Now, if I had done this for real, if I had really taken my time, I would insert a step here. I would go to unrated photos. So you see nothing has a star. I would select all of these images and I would delete them from my disk. And that's because this is a little bit dangerous, right? Because you have to really make sure that you're doing the right thing. But at this point in time, I usually keep them on my memory card as a backup in case I want to go back and pull something from it or I make a mistake. But that helps me manage files because we've gotten to a point where storage is just really challenging. It's so expensive. You either have a cloud service or you have a million hard drives or some really big multi-terabit hard drives to be able to store all of your photos. So we're not really covering that today, but you just saw step one. So I imported the photos and then I gave my favorites a rating. And at this point, Now I go into actually editing. So we're in the library view, which is helpful for navigating between photos. Now I'm going to go into the develop mode, which gives me more options on the right-hand side. The way this is organized are into these little drop-down panels. So I'm just going to collapse all of them and then open them up as we go. The first thing that I like to do is look at calibration. Sorry, effects, lens corrections. There we go. So I usually like to assign a lens correction profile, which tells Lightroom which camera I used to take the photo and what lens I used. Already it's automatically pulling that. And I want to make sure that enable profile corrections is applied. So if you have any weird vignetting that Lightroom knows happens with the 400 millimeter lens that I used, it's gonna correct that automatically. Let me show you what it looks like without it. Not much of a difference, but occasionally you see how it opens the image up, kind of like pushes the outside out. And if you're taking architectural photos, this is gonna help you make sure that all of your vertical and horizontal lines are flush. There's more that you can do for that, but it's just helpful to look at. Chromatic aberration, I'm not worried about that for my purposes. All right, so we're done with that. Now I'm going to go up to the basic panel. And this is the bread and butter of this whole thing. So up here, remember the histogram is what I'm always watching to make sure that I'm doing things appropriately. And clipping is something that we want to avoid. So clipping means that you've lost information in some part of the image. And if you turn these they look like little up arrows. If you click them or hover over them, it's going to display the part of the image where you've lost information. So I'm going to turn those on and I'm going to show you what I mean. Right now, I'm dropping my blacks and my whites all the way out. And what you're seeing is because I've done that, I've overexposed the image. I've lost information in both the whites and the blacks, the lightest parts of the image and the darkest parts of the image. What you want to do is find the place where you regain information at both the lightest and darkest parts of your image. On this particular shot, it was a pretty neutral shot. And so it was already out of the camera pretty much in the right spot. So I'm watching the right hand caret up here as I'm dragging the whites to set the white point. And what I want to do is get right to the edge where I've pushed the whites as bright as they can go without clipping. Now I'm going to do the same thing with the blacks. I'm going to bring that down, and right now we're clipping. I'm going to bring it back out up until the point where that caret is no longer white. There it goes. Now it's out. So I've regained all of the information possible. And you're noticing, because I have that feature engaged, in the center of the image, I overexposed this little patch of the wing, and I underexposed these little patches of the wing as well. That really doesn't matter. There's hardly any part of the image is missing. If I were to do a huge print of this image, which this isn't worth it because it's not a great image, I would address that in Photoshop to bring back some information, because in the areas that are blown out, there will be no information. There will be no ink in that area. That's why it's super important to start with adjusting your whites and blacks. All right. That's called setting the white point and setting the black point, if you're interested in technicality. The next thing that I usually do is take a look at the histogram. We've set our white and black points, and this image is really well exposed. The other thing I'll note here is that your computer should be set to a halfway brightness. So that's like the rule of thumb. There are a lot of tutorials out there. If you just Google how to calibrate my screen for photo editing, and plug in your model of computer, there are all kinds of tutorials that will walk you through how to calibrate your screen so that you edit your photos in a way that's going to display well. Because most likely you're going to export those photos to send them to print. Maybe you'll upload them to your website or put them on social media. And if you're doing a really big print, you want the color and the exposure to match the way that it's going to be exported. So for me, I do it like some professionals are really nitpicky. For me, I leave my brightness at a half and I make sure that my monitor is calibrated so that I'm not editing warm or cool. We'll talk about that in a minute. And then I go from there. So just Google that. That's like its own webinar. It could take hours to really dive into that. But the next thing that I usually do at this point in time is take a look at the color. Usually for me, I'm shooting a lot of the natural world, and often I'll set a locked in temperature to 5500 Kelvin. And what that does is it just has a reference point. Sometimes I'll go in and adjust it and I'll try and match color in the field. But I find that if I'm always shooting with natural light, unless I'm shooting at odd hours of the day, kind of leaving it at that is nice. Or going into, I really do find that the auto color balance works really well for photography. But remember that if you're doing video, that you should always set your color balance. You can use the automatic settings over here. For daylight, yeah, it warmed the image up. For auto, it cooled it down. And here's as shot. For me, I'm always trying to replicate the color that I saw in the moment. So I'm not crazy about this image. I'm just going to edit the next one. I thought this one was much better. Um, so I'm bringing that black point up. I'm pushing that white point up until it clips, bring it back down. And now this image to me feels a little dark still. And you can see in the histogram, the middle, the most information is sitting right here. So I want to create a little more contrast. I want to spread that out. So usually I open up the shadows a bit and then I bring the highlights down a bit. And that puts me in a pretty good place. This image feels like it needs to warm up to my eye and potentially get a little bit more into the red hue. Here's a trick for setting color point, and it looks really bad at first. I'm going to bump the saturation to 100. And then I'm going to take the sliders, put them back to where they were originally as shot. And then I'm going to take the blue orange slider at the top, the warm cool slider. I'm going to push it all the way down into blue so I can look at that, all the way into orange, look at that. And I'm trying to find the middle place where it's not blue and it's not orange, it's fairly neutral. Some people edit photos that way. For the most part, we got some buffering issues. Just a second. So for me, I'm just using my eye to kind of say, ooh, that's too cold. That's too warm. Where do they meet? And that's about where they meet in my eye. That's too green. That's too magenta. To me, they meet right there. So that's the rough color profile. I'm going to fine tune that at a later step, but for right now, that feels pretty good to me. Now, Lightroom has some pretty hefty new software, and I haven't decided how I feel about it, but I want to show you what it can do. I'm going to select the subject. It's going to take a minute, and there it goes. That's AI technology for you. Now, I'm going to create an inverted mask. So now it's selecting the background. You can see it made a mistake down here. It actually thinks that's a part of the bird. And so I'm going to go ahead and I want to edit this mask. And I want to, you know what? I think that's going to be too technical. We're going to leave that for now, but let me just show you the power of this tool. So as I bring that slider down, it's protecting the bird and bringing everything else down. This should never, for my style, it's important that this is used with a super light touch. And in the past, people would achieve this a different way. So there's a lot of discussion around like, oh, you're using Photoshop and that's not true art. You're manipulating the image. But the reality is a lot of our heroes like Ansel Adams were doing a ton of editing in the darkroom. They pioneered techniques that we use now. So Ansel Adams, when you're doing film photography, you expose the film to light when you're taking an image. And then you take that film in the darkroom and you have to treat that film, fix the image, and then you need to put light through that film onto photographic paper and expose the image again. And in that time, it usually takes like 5 to 8 seconds to expose the the negative onto the photographic paper. Ansel Adams was a wizard. He would use what's called burning and dodging. So he would use like a piece of metal attached to a little black leather piece of leather, and he would cover areas of the image that he wanted to protect from being overexposed. So he could darken and lighten parts of the image using physical manipulation of where the light was coming through that film and then hitting the photographic paper. We're doing the same thing here in Lightroom. And so I can create a brush feature which is mimicking how they would use different wands and different devices to block light. And then I go over here, you can adjust the size of that, see how it's getting bigger, smaller. I like a fairly large brush. You can change the feather, which essentially means how harsh your movement is. And the way that they would feather in the dark room is by moving it around quickly. If you just held it in one spot, you would burn a hole through the image, essentially, or an area that isn't burned. So for this, the effect that I want is down here. So you can say I want to reduce the exposure of areas that I use this tool. So I'm going to brush the image on the outside. This is way too much, but I'm just doing this to show you another way to do the same thing. Essentially, all this photo editing software has millions of ways to achieve the same effect. So I just wanted to show you two different ways. I just created a mask over the top of this photo. One of the reasons why photographers love Lightroom is that you're not degrading the original file. The original file lives on your hard drive, and then the edits live separate over the top. And at the end of this process, you're going to export a file that will be your final edit for a specific application. And you're going to set the file size and the color profile and all of that so that it's going to match exactly what you want. But I'm just going to undo that, go back to the neutral. I want to show you a couple other things, just editing a different photo, just for some diversity of what we're looking at. And I know we said that this was a landscape photography lesson, so let's take a look at a couple of the wider shots. I was excited. I think this one will be a nice one to explore. It's not my favorite image. Let's do this one. This one I was excited about. This tree was kind of backlit and illuminated brighter than its surroundings. I'm not crazy about this composition. I think this one might be a stronger image. So let's edit this one. I'm going to go into these sliders again. I'm in the develop tool. And the first thing I do is set the black point. And there's the clipping. And now set the white point. And there's the clipping. And at that point, when I'm doing that, I'm not even looking at the image. I'm just looking at the caret up at the top to tell me if I've properly exposed the image. From here, now I introduce style to my editing. Right now, that's technical. I just want to make sure all the information is in it. but it's possible I don't love how that exposed the image. For instance, right now, I kind of feel like that created this harsh image where the first image that we started with, let me get back to it, and you can always hit Y to compare before and after. So on the left is the original, on the right is setting the white and the black point. And I don't love how bright that made it. So I'm just going to go ahead and hit Y. So we're just looking at the image we're editing. I kind of like it when the white point is set lower. I like a slightly more dramatic image because I want to preserve the detail in that part right there. So I'm happy with that. The next phase of what I would do is the color balance. I think it needs a little bit more warmth, but I kind of like the blue tones. This was taken early morning, so the light is a little bit more blue at that point in time. You can get color cards that you put in the field to be able to perfectly match color, but I always find that it's kind of easier just to rely on how I feel when I'm editing the image. I just want the next thing I'll do is play around with contrast. I'll just see what is it doing if I do this. That's too harsh for my eye. That's too weak. I kind of liked it just sitting right where it was. I might bring the highlights down just a smidge to recover some detail, and sometimes I'll zoom in while I'm doing that. Um, like I said, there are a million ways to do this. So now I want to show you the next way that you could edit this image. So I'm just going to hit reset to bring it back to neutral. I want to get the color balance right before I do this next phase. So we've been living in this. That's kind of the intro to Lightroom. I set my white and black point. I play with shadows and highlights. Exposure is the most dramatic thing you can do, and I try to avoid touching that unless I didn't expose the image properly. We're going to leave this panel behind. Now we're going to take a look at tone curve. And this can be a really helpful tool for light in landscape images. And for me, I typically will do this in Photoshop because there's a lot more granular adjustments that you can do. But Photoshop, I don't think I'm going to show you one thing in Photoshop just that can be helpful for clients. But we're not going to spend too much time on that. But essentially, this is just manipulating the same information in a different way. So for me, I'm going to start by recovering some highlights by bringing that down, brighten up the lighter areas of the image. You can see it's bowing out this line up here. And then I want to recover some of the darks. And actually for this image, stylistically, I like the idea of losing some of the dark. So you're seeing the bottom bow down here. And finally, in this image, normally I'm opening up the shadows, but I want to heighten the drama of that tree, maybe bring down the shadows just a smidge. You can do all of that by manipulating this. So you can drag down. The thing I don't like about Lightroom is usually you can add points that hold the line still, and Lightroom doesn't really do that very well. You can do this across each color profile, but if you're getting to that level of granularity in Lightroom, I suggest you edit in Photoshop. So for now, let's turn that aside. And I want to introduce you to these beautiful sliders, which if you have a complicated image, let me pull one up. This image is complicated for a few reasons. I don't want to edit that one right now. I think I'd like to edit one of these. This one. This one's complicated because we have frost, which has some refraction and can cause some interesting colors to come through. So if I'm editing this shot, I'm going to go through the same steps that we've been doing so far. And I hope everyone's writing questions as we go, and I'll address those at the very end. We'll play around the shadows, bring the highlights down. This exposure seems a little bit wrong to me. Like my eye isn't very drawn to what I want it to be drawn to. There's a lot of information around the outside of the image that I don't love. And for me, this image, the purpose of it would just be for social media to show you what it feels like to look at this up close. This is not a great shot. It's not one of my favorites, but I do like the frost that's forming on the cranberry. And it does make you feel like you're right at the level of the moss. But a couple things you can do is introduce a little bit of a vignette. Um, this is kind of the crude way to do a vignette. There's a more refined way in Photoshop, but for now, I'm just drawing your eye into the center of this area by darkening the outside. Um, and then there's also the idea that you can do a filter um, and just do a radial gradient, draw it out from the center. And this is another way to do the same thing. I can brighten the center of the image. I wouldn't necessarily do both of these things together. But the other thing, now that I've built that graduated filter, I can invert it. So now I'm editing the inverse so the outside is selected. And if I wanted to draw my eye into the center, um, I could come in here and select the sharpness and drop that down. And what that's going to do, hit enter to be able to see what you've done, is out around the outside of the image, it's going to remove the definition that you see in these areas. So if I undo it, here's the original image, redo it. It's just bringing a little bit of that out. So the other thing you can do is clarity. Clarity is going to be much more dramatic. Let me make sure I'm selecting the filter that I want. So the filter is selecting the outside of the image right now up here. And I'm working on clarity and I'm going to drop it down. See how all of a sudden, we're going to zoom in on that. All of a sudden there's a lot less detail on the outside because we've introduced that. So those are just a couple tools to keep in your back pocket. It can recover, like it can help you tell a story. That's not like fine art photography. I'm not going to do that to images that I'm going to print and try and sell in a fine art world. But I am going to do it to images in a blog where I want your eye to be focused on the cranberry. Obviously, another tool that we have, our cameras are just at an insane point in time where these files are gigantic. And if I wanted people just to pay attention to the cranberry, I could just crop right into that, bring those highlights down, bring the contrast up, bring the exposure up a little bit, take a look at my histogram, make sure that it's in a place that's normal. I'm losing some information in the dark part of the image, so I'm going to bump that up, and I'm going to bump the whites up as well. And I don't love that composition. I'm going to put it right there because I'm going to use the rule of thirds, and it satisfies our eyes to position the subject on the point of those those two lines that are creating three columns. So that's kind of a starting place. It's not a great image. I don't love this one. I'm just going to move on and take a look at something else. Just a time check. I want to leave room for questions. Let me do one more edit, and I want to talk about those color sliders that we were going to talk about. So super granular at first, or kind of broad strokes. I'm just doing the same stuff. White point, black point, highlights. And in this instance, I like the shadows where they're at. And in this image, I'm going to show you something that I like to do. Right now, it just feels like the left-hand side is dark, the right-hand side is bright, and that's distracting me. So I'm just going to darken the right-hand side of the image. And in this instance, sometimes I start with the shadows. It's a little bit less severe than grabbing the exposure. And just bring those shadows down, bring those highlights down, and that feels like a more balanced image. If you start using exposure, start to see it's pretty dramatic and starts to get a little bit scary. But we're going to go down to the color mixer. Sometimes I use the color mixer as a way to increase the contrast of an image. Or if the color is just not coming through properly. This morning was wild because this was all frost covering the sphagnum moss. The sphagnum moss is usually like magenta red, and the frost is making it come through pink. So this is just like a wild. I'm so excited to actually edit these images. But usually when I've got a lot of a certain color, I'm going to zoom in on a portion of that image. And this is from a drone really high up, so the clarity is not going to be great. It's not a full frame sensor. But I just want to get in to look at those greens and those magentas and see whether it makes it look more natural when I play with these colors a little bit. In this instance, it's not really doing much for me, and I think my computer is having a hard time keeping up. But this is super granular. And in some images, it's the difference between a great edit and a pretty poor edit. For me, I'm always adjusting these to try and make it look as natural as possible and how I remember experiencing it at the time. Blue is one of my favorite tricks. So these sliders can be super important if you have sky in your image and that sky gets a little bit blown out like this. You go down to these aqua and blue sliders. I'm just going to make it a little bit deeper, and the saturation I'm going to bring up just a smidge, and then the luminance is going to recover detail in those areas. And I don't like how saturated that is, but rather than going up here and dropping your highlights, which applies it to the whole image, you can go down into what I was doing before, which is a little bit more of a specific thing. The other thing you can do is select the sky. One thing I'll note here is that this is using AI technology. And on social media and on websites, we're starting to get uh, there are some AI detection softwares out there that if I publish this photo, if I export this from Lightroom, there's metadata attached to it that tells other people that I used AI software on this image, and it might tell people, it might tattletale on me, and it might actually flag it as an AI generated image. So that's a little bit scary. We're essentially like, from a philosophical or sociological standpoint, we're trying to weed out artwork that's created by AI, or at least flag it for users. And so I predict, like, in the next few years on Instagram, if I import an image that I've selected the sky using AI, I think we're going to get to a place where it's going to tell people, hey, this image was AI generated. That's just being a little bit pessimistic, but it's kind of where we're headed. Um, but this image, just to show you one more time the power of this stuff. This image was pretty flat coming in. I love the composition. Super excited about it. Gonna bring those blacks down. I want to reveal some detail in the shadows of those trees, bring the highlights down a little bit, and contrast is fine where it is. Oh boy, I'm editing. Someone's laughing at me because I'm editing the filter, not the whole photo. Let me just delete that filter. Someone's out there and they know what happened there. Sorry. So that's why it wasn't applied to the whole image. We're going to see the impact a lot better here. There we go. We're opening up the shadows, bringing the highlights down. I don't like what that did to the image, so I'm going to leave that where it is, bump the contrast just a little bit. And because of this big gap here of information, I'm going to bump the whole exposure up, and then I'm going to protect the highlights by bringing the white point down from where it was, and maybe even drop the highlights a little bit there. The next thing I'm going to do on this image is add a linear gradient from the bottom up and see how it's much less powerful up on the top and much more powerful on the bottom. I'm going to just open up the exposure and the shadows just a smidge. Going to hit enter to get out of that. And then I'm going to go down here to what I was doing earlier and just make sure I'm happy with the sky. I want the luminance to be a little bit less. And personally, I really love selecting the sky. and dropping it down just a smidge to be able to bring back that detail. You don't want to use a heavy hand on this, but I do want to recover information. And the worse your camera is, like this camera is great. It's a Hasselblad, but it's a 4/3 micro sensor. It's not a full frame camera, and so the difference is going to be if you blow out your highlights, it's going to be really hard to recover them. So I'm pretty happy with this image. It's not done. I'm going to spend a lot more time fine tuning it to bring out the richness of this color, which I know is more vibrant than that in real life. And then to maybe do some applications here, because I feel like my eye is drawn into the center of the image, but I'd like it to spend more time following the tree line on the bottom. Really, that might be a compositional error. Maybe I should have pointed the camera down a bit more. But that's how I operate at this phase. Once I've edited all of these photos, I'm going to go back into library. I'm going to go back into the view of all of them together. I'm just going to scroll through and pick out some of the standouts. So usually I'll kind of go, and we didn't get through all these, so this is a bad example, but I'm going to go through the photos and now I'm going to start to star them 2 stars when I really like something. And then I'm going to filter everything down by selecting rated and filter it by greater or equal to 2. Now I'm down to 3 photos. I do some fine tuning on those ones because I want to make sure they're perfect, and then I export them at the file size that I want. I'd love to leave a little room for questions, so let's open it up these last few minutes, and I'll see what I can do to answer your questions.
All right, Charlie, thank you so much. Now, before we dive into the questions, I would like to remind everyone that you can submit your questions via the question field in your control panel. All right, so let's get to some of these questions. So, first one, are you editing on a Mac or do you use Windows? And does it matter?
Uh, doesn't matter. Lightroom works on both. It's just a preference of what you like. I've heard a lot of people starting to um, feel like Mac displays are too bright. And so when they export their photos to print, they end up printing too dark. And my way of compensating for that is bumping down my screen display brightness even further than half so that I'm compensating for that in my editing process. And then paying really close attention to your histogram. And if you're working with a printer, doing test prints to see if you're recovering all the information in the image. So it doesn't matter what platform. I'm on MacBook Pro when I'm on an assignment, and as soon as I get back to my office, I'm on a big um, Mac desktop with all kinds of hard drives. And just backing up your photos is super important. So I have a 12 terabyte system that I love that's backing up all of my information, and then I have an 8 terabyte kind of working platform where I'm dumping all my photos. Um, and even that, some people would look at that and be like, ah, you're not backing up enough. Yeah, thanks for the question.
All right. So let's talk buffering for a second. How can I tell if I'm fully buffered? And do you have any tricks or settings to speed up Lightroom buffering?
Yeah, so you can go into the settings of your computer. If your computer has low processing power, you can maximize it by going into your computer's RAM and just Google how to limit processing power on all programs except for, and then insert your photo processor. So if you're using Lightroom, you're gonna go into the Lightroom settings on your computer and maximize the RAM dedicated to that program, and then shut everything else down for the process of photo editing. And then after you're done, you'll bring that back up. But the other way too is to have an external hard drive that you're plugging into your laptop, and you keep all the files on that external hard drive.
Great, thank you. So Are you working with RAW or JPEG, and does it matter?
Yeah, it matters big time. I did skip over that. If you're doing this type of editing, if you're spending time editing your photos, you have to shoot RAW. There's so much more information. JPEG is just not going to cut it. You're going to hit a wall, especially when you're trying to open up the shadows or protect the highlights. It's just going to crumble. As soon as you have a lot more flexibility. For this image in particular, like if I were to go here and drop the highlights all the way down. If this was a JPEG image, this image would just get soft and messy and kind of just crumble apart like a mealy apple. But with a raw image, it's a ton more information. You have a lot more flexibility, and you can recover a lot more from even if you expose something in a way that's bad. That you did a bad job with the picture.
Is there an easy way to undo or redo an edit?
Yeah, it's super easy. Over on the left-hand panel, let's see. Photoshop is what I'm more familiar with on the history side. But you can just do Command Z as many times as you want to go back. Or if you want to just see the beginning image, you hit Y to show the comparison. Or you hit reset down here. Um, I don't know if it shows a history down here. I don't think it does. But Photoshop is better for that because it'll literally show you every single click you made and you can go back to a previous version. Lightroom is kind of like it's trying to streamline the workflow. And for the most part, that's great. Usually I start here and then I identify those 3 images that get 4 stars. And then I bring that into Photoshop and I start over because I have a different workflow that I use over there. That's more powerful and can result in a much higher quality end result. Um, and so that's how I edit like my big um, if I print anything at the scale behind me, that's what I'm using.
Gotcha. Thank you. So, is there any way to change the brightness of one side of an image and not the other?
Yeah, so that'd be using a graduated filter, kind of like we did before. The linear gradient. So these are your filters over here, and you just grab that linear gradient. And in this is a good example because we've got kind of we read our eyes visually read red as a darker color than yellow. So even if this is perfectly exposed, you might want to put that filter on and raise the exposure of the right-hand side to balance that out a little bit more. So that would be how you do that.
Gotcha. So, can you again let us know how did you darken part of the drone image with the paintbrush?
Yeah, I can go back to that drone image. Let's take a look at this one. So let's see. I actually like the idea of doing a different one. To me, this area is a distraction, this left-hand side of this image. We haven't edited this at all. Usually I'm doing filters at the very end. So for the purposes of this, I'm just going to drop down the black point, raise the white point, open up the shadows, highlights down, contrast too much. And that's pretty good for now. So we'll leave it there. This area is distracting because it's this tan big swath that's kind of lit by the sun. I want your eye to spend time on the river. So a couple things I would do is select the brush feature, set the size to what I want, which that's about right for what I want, and go down here. I don't want it to adjust anything other than make the highlights lower, shadows lower, and a smidge down on exposure. Go and paint that area of the image. And I want it to blend. So I just held my finger down to do that. And then once you have created a filter and you've selected that filter, you can come over here and adjust it. So see, I've got full flexibility to make it dark, light, change all of these values. Stay away from the exposure. The best way, the gentle way is with shadows and highlights. I think that feels like it blends pretty well with the rest of this, but notice the sunlight is hitting that area more than the other one. So it's a little bit warmer in temperature. I'm going to cool that area down, not too much, just a smidge, just to balance out the image. And now your eye is allowed to move around this image in a different way. And if I wanted to, and some people will cringe at this, I haven't decided how I want to edit this image, but I'm going to create another filter brush. I'm going to make the size of the brush much smaller. And what I'd like to do is paint the river. That's the river right there. I would do this more at a very granular level, but I just want to show you what it does to the image. You can see what it's like if you give it a little more definition by making the shadows darker. You can open it up. To me, I kind of like the shadows darker, maybe a tiny bit more contrast, maybe bring the highlights down. To me, that kind of brings your eye to that area a little bit more. To me, so many people are like, oh, Photoshop, like you're manipulating the image and making it not real. To me, the whole purpose is to communicate something through an image. Like this image, I want people to be like, what on earth is this? Like, what is this place? I want them to be interested. And so I'm going to use these tools to try and draw their eye to something that I want to draw their attention to. I don't love this composition. It's not great for me. So like already I'm wondering if a vertical crop is actually what's going to make this image feel a little bit better. And by doing that already, the drone, it's not super high quality in terms of like in comparison to the camera that I have that I'm usually using. So I'm not going to be able to print this at a huge scale unless I do some good upsampling on it. Um, I'm really cautious about saturation and vibrance. I try to accomplish that through these sliders down here. And just a final note on this edit is I just want to adjust it a little bit vertically. And you're seeing that I lose some information if I do that, but it just feels a little off to me. So if I would play a little bit more, even with, I know the drone is dead level, but to your eye, it just felt a little bit askew. So I'd play around with that. But you're getting the sense of it. Like, be playful. You can also like duplicate the image and have multiple edits of the same image and see which one you like the best. Um, there's kind of infinite possibilities, and hopefully this kind of gave you a picture of how I go about navigating that.
Great. Thank you so much. Now, if we're getting our photos printed by a company, should we choose the color compensation option?
For me, when I go to export, and I'm not an expert on this, I just have a printer that I use that I know the team there. I can talk with them. I can send them my file, have them send me a proof. Um, I know what their printer profile is like. I'm just doing what I've just done, and then I'm exporting it at a TIFF file format as big as possible, and then letting them work their magic. They're not correcting it at all. I know their color profile, so I'm exporting it at sRGB workspace, but that's kind of like its own. You could spend a lifetime learning like how to perfectly calibrate your images. But yeah, it might be a little too much for the moment on this webinar.
And do you have any opinion about the Topaz plugins to enhance a final image?
Only if you're the only reason to do that in my mind um, to is if you're shooting astrophotography, if you're shooting in really low light, if you're doing wildlife photography with a really long lens and you've got to bump your ISO, or if you're printing really large scale or displaying your work really large scale. I do use Topaz, but Lightroom is catching up. They've started to put in some really good AI um, Let me just find it here. I can't remember what it's under. Detail is what it's under. So you can hit denoise. It's going to work for a while in the background. It might take a while, and then it's going to do the same thing that Topaz does. Topaz does it a little bit better. And if you want to upsample your image, like make it 10 times bigger, Topaz is the way to do it. But I don't know. I don't love using that tool. I only use it if there's a story that I have to tell that requires a noisy image that I'd like to clean up. So that's you can also do manual noise reduction just right here with those sliders, which just to give you a feel for that, just smooths everything out. But you can definitely do too much of it.
Great. Thank you so much, Charlie. Unfortunately, that will be the last question that we do have time for today. So I'd like to throw it back to you for some closing comments.
Absolutely. Well, thank you everyone for tuning in. I appreciate it. I hope this was helpful. It's always challenging because I don't know necessarily like where people are coming in, like what experience level. So if this was helpful, send me a note because and tell me the parts of it that worked well, that didn't. This was kind of a new format for me of how I ran this. So if you'd like to see more of this or go on a more granular topic, let me know. I've got some webinars coming up December 20th and 27th. So I'll be doing some photography webinars for that for sure. But thank you so much for joining me and have a wonderful weekend.
And thank you for taking the time to present for us today. And I'd also like to thank everyone who joined us today. If you are interested in information on how you can travel with NatHab, please give us a call at 800-543-8917, or you can send us an email at info@nathab.com. Our adventure specialists are happy to help you out. Join us Monday for our next Daily Dose of Nature. You can check out next week's lineup, including registration links, on our website at nathab.com/webinars. We did record today's presentation, and we will have the replay available on our website soon. With that, I will conclude today's webinar. Goodbye, everybody. We'll see you next time.